And West Asia, Israel. A severe storm has swept across the country and occupied the West Bank, bringing heavy rain, flooding, and
A storm had already passed over Jerusalem, but what came after it is not what most people expected. Because usually, when a storm ends, everything is supposed to settle. The sky clears, the streets dry, and life returns to normal. But in Jerusalem, something was different. Not a second storm, not visible destruction, not something loud enough to immediately explain. It was something quieter. And that is exactly what made it harder to ignore. People began reporting small, unusual details in the hours and days that followed. Things that on their own could easily be dismissed, but together started forming a pattern no one could confidently explain away. The air didn't feel the same to some. Light seemed slightly different to others, and in certain areas, witnesses described a strange sense of shift, as if the environment itself had not fully returned to what it was before. At first, these accounts stayed separate. Different people, different places, different moments. But as more reports surfaced, something changed. Because now it wasn't just isolated observation anymore, it was becoming a shared discussion. And once that happens, the situation stops being simple weather recovery and starts turning into something else entirely. Something people begin interpreting instead of just describing. And this is where the real question quietly appears. Was anything actually happening in Jerusalem after the storm? Or are people only noticing patterns because they're already looking for meaning? Either way, what follows next is where the details start to get even harder to dismiss. And as these scattered reports began to circulate more widely, the focus slowly started shifting. At first, it was nothing more than casual discussion. People sharing observations online, mentioning what they felt, what they noticed, what seemed slightly off after the storm. But then something important happened. The conversation didn't fade. It grew. Because once enough people start describing similar impressions, no matter how small or subjective, they stop feeling like coincidence to those paying attention. And in the case of Jerusalem, that effect becomes even stronger, not because the city is unfamiliar with storms, but because it is never just a city in how people interpret it. Every detail here tends to carry weight beyond its physical form. So when some witnesses mentioned subtle changes in atmosphere, others began re-examining their own experience more carefully. They started asking, was that feeling real? Or did I only notice it after hearing others talk about it? And that question alone is powerful enough to reshape perception. Because memory and interpretation are not always separate things. Sometimes they overlap without people realizing it. As more time passed, two clear streams of explanation began forming. On one side, people continued to ground everything in natural reasoning. They pointed to post-storm environmental effects, humidity shifts, dust movement, temperature imbalance, light scattering across wet stone surfaces, all of which can easily create unusual sensory impressions in a city like Jerusalem. From that perspective, nothing unusual is required to explain what people felt. But on the other side, something different was happening. People weren't only analyzing what they saw, they were trying to understand why it felt meaningful. And that is where interpretation begins to separate from observation. Because Jerusalem is not experienced like an ordinary location in the minds of millions. It carries historical memory, emotional expectation, and deep symbolic association layered over everything that happens there. So even subtle environmental shifts can feel amplified in significance. And once both perspectives enter the same conversation, something changes. The discussion stops being about events alone and starts becoming about meaning, about whether these details are just effects of natural conditions, or whether the human mind is detecting a pattern it doesn't fully understand yet. And the more people try to resolve that question, the more the uncertainty itself becomes the center of attention, not the storm, not the aftermath, but what people believe might be forming inside it. And this is where the situation quietly moves into its next phase. Because now, attention is no longer limited to what happened immediately after the storm. It begins expanding toward what people are claiming they notice next. As attention shifted beyond the initial post-storm discussion, the first detailed reports began to surface. Not dramatic headlines at first, not official confirmations, just scattered accounts from different areas of Jerusalem, slowly building into something people could no longer ignore. One of the earliest things mentioned was the atmosphere. Some witnesses described it as heavier than expected for a city that had already gone through clearing winds after the storm. Others said the light itself felt slightly unusual, not clearly different in a measurable way, but enough to make familiar streets look unfamiliar for brief moments during the day. At first, these descriptions were dismissed as normal post-storm perception effects. After all, weather systems can distort visibility, humidity can affect breathing comfort, and dust in the air can subtly shift how light behaves across stone surfaces. But then came something that changed how people were starting to group these experiences together. Because the reports didn't stay isolated. They began repeating across different locations. Not identical wording, but similar structure. A feeling described as unusual stillness in one area, a sense of visual imbalance in another, and in some cases, a quiet claim that sound itself felt slightly different, muted in places where it normally wouldn't be. None of these individually were enough to confirm anything unusual, but together they created a pattern that people were struggling to categorize, and that is where the shift begins. Because once multiple unrelated observers start describing variations of the same type of experience, attention naturally moves from individual perception to shared phenomenon, even if nothing objectively new is happening. And that is exactly what makes situations like this unstable in interpretation. Because now, every explanation starts competing with another. Natural explanations still make sense. Environmental conditions still matter, and psychological expectation after a major storm is still a powerful factor. But at the same time, something else begins forming in the background of public discussion. Not evidence, not confirmation, but curiosity. The kind of curiosity that doesn't wait for clarity before it starts building its own meaning. People begin rechecking earlier moments of the day, replaying what they felt, comparing it with what others are saying. And slowly, without realizing it, the conversation stops being about whether something happened and starts talking about whether something is being missed. And in a place like Jerusalem, that question carries even more weight than usual, because history has trained people to treat even small details as potentially significant. So now the discussion enters a more focused phase, where reports are no longer just post-storm impressions, but are starting to be treated as possible early indicators of something deeper still, unfolding. And this is where the narrative takes its next turn. Because what begins as a subtle environmental description is about to move towards specific, more difficult to explain claims. As the conversation intensified online and in local discussions, the tone of the reports began to change again. Because now, people are no longer only describing general feelings or atmospheric impressions. They were pointing to specific moments, specific places, and specific experiences that stood out sharply against everything that was supposed to be normal recovery after the storm. One of the first recurring claims came from multiple directions of the old city. Several witnesses described brief moments where the environment felt visually unstable, not in a dramatic or supernatural way, but in a way that made familiar surroundings feel slightly out of sync. For example, some said that stone surfaces appeared to shift in tone under changing light more rapidly than expected, almost as if the contrast between shadow and brightness was fluctuating unevenly across narrow streets. Others mentioned something even harder to define. A momentary feeling that distance itself looked altered. Not physically changing, of course, but a perception where buildings, walls, or pathways appeared slightly closer or further for a few seconds before returning to normal. Individually, these accounts could still be explained. Jerusalem's dense architecture, reflective limestone, uneven terrain, and post-storm moisture in the air can all create optical distortions under shifting sunlight. But what made people pause was not the possibility of explanation. It was repetition, because similar descriptions were not coming from one location alone. They were appearing in different areas of the city, from people who had no connection to each other. And that is where interpretation begins to tighten. At the same time, another category of reports started gaining attention: sound-related observations. Some individuals claim that in certain narrow sections of the old city, footsteps, voices, or background street noise felt unusually dampened for brief moments, almost as if the environment had absorbed the usual echo patterns and then released them back to normal seconds later. Again, nothing here defied physics in a direct way. Urban acoustics can change significantly after rainfall, especially in stone-heavy environments where moisture affects reflection and absorption of sound. But the timing of these descriptions, clustered after the storm, layered over already unusual atmosphere reports, made people more attentive than they normally would be. And once attention increases, even subtle details start feeling amplified. What was once ignored becomes noticeable, what was once normal becomes questionable. And slowly, the discussion starts shifting again. From maybe it's just weather effects, to why are so many people noticing the same kind of unusual patterns at the same time? That question doesn't require an answer to stay active. It only needs uncertainty. And in situations like this, uncertainty spreads faster than explanation, because explanation closes a story, but uncertainty keeps it moving forward. And now, the narrative is no longer anchored in general post-storm effects. It is moving towards something more focused. Reports that begin pointing towards specific locations and repeatable anomalies in the same zones of the city. And that is where the situation starts to feel even more concentrated, as if certain areas of Jerusalem are drawing more attention than others without any clear reason yet. As these reports continued to circulate, something subtle but important began to change in how people were organizing the information. At first, everything was scattered. Different streets, different observers, different times. But gradually, patterns of location started to emerge, because certain areas of Jerusalem were being mentioned more often than others. Not through official reporting, but through repeated personal accounts shared across conversations, posts, and testimonies. And one of the places that began appearing more frequently in these discussions was the old city zone surrounding the Western Wall. Some visitors described the atmosphere there as feeling unusually still compared to surrounding streets. Not silent in the literal sense. People were still present, movement still existed, but the background sense of normal urban rhythm seemed slightly muted at times. Others described brief moments where the environment felt emotionally intensified, as if personal awareness became sharper than usual in that specific space. It is important to note that none of these descriptions point to a measurable physical change, but perception in highly significant historical locations often behaves differently than in ordinary environments, because expectation itself becomes part of what people experience. And in Jerusalem, expectation is never neutral. At the same time, similar reports were loosely connected to other nearby areas within the old city structure. Narrow stone pathways, open courtyards, elevated viewpoints overlooking ancient architecture. People were not claiming a single unified event, but rather a pattern of localized impressions that seemed more noticeable in historically dense sections of the city. And this is where interpretation starts to deepen again, because once attention shifts towards specific zones, the conversation changes shape. It is no longer about general post-storm effects. It becomes about why certain places feel different from others, even under similar conditions. From a scientific perspective, there are still grounded explanations. Stone architecture, uneven airflow between narrow streets, residual moisture from heavy rainfall, and temperature variation between shaded and open areas can all influence how people perceive sound, light, and even emotional tone. But alongside that explanation, another layer of interpretation continues to grow in the background, because Jerusalem is not experienced purely as geography. It is experienced as memory, history, and meaning layered together. So when people feel something unusual even briefly, in a place already charged with symbolic significance, the impression tends to stay longer in the mind. And as more accounts cluster around these same zones, the discussion begins to shift again, from scattered impressions to localized patterns. And from localized patterns toward the possibility that certain areas are simply more sensitive to perception after environmental disruption. Or at least, that is how some people begin framing it. But not everyone agrees, because others believe this is exactly how meaningful patterns begin to form in public consciousness, quietly, gradually, and without any single defining moment. And now, attention starts narrowing even further, because the focus is no longer the entire city. It is becoming concentrated around specific landmarks and what people claim to experience near them. And that is where the next layer of the story begins to take shape. As attention continued narrowing towards specific locations, the Western Wall began to dominate the conversation more than any other part of the city. Not because of a single confirmed incident, but because of repeated descriptions that started clustering around that exact space. Some visitors described moments where the atmosphere near the wall felt unusually crimson, as if the surrounding noise and movement of the old city softened slightly when they stepped closer to the stone. Others said their focus became sharper there in a way that felt hard to explain. Not emotional exaggeration in the dramatic sense, but a subtle shift in awareness where time felt less distracted and attention naturally settled into a quieter internal state. From a psychological standpoint, this is not unusual for places of deep historical or spiritual significance. When people enter environments they already associate with meaning, their perception often becomes more sensitive, not less. But what made the discussion grow was not any single experience. It was the consistency of similar phrasing appearing across unrelated accounts. Words like still, heavy, different, and hard to describe began repeating in descriptions of the same general area. And once repetition enters perception-based reporting, interpretation becomes more active than observation. At the same time, a second layer of discussion began forming around visual impressions. Some individuals claimed that the stone surface of the wall appeared to look different under changing light conditions shortly after the storm period, though always briefly, and never in a way that could be captured consistently or confirmed universally. To others, this was easily explained. Wet stone reflects light unevenly. Dust particles in the air scatter brightness differently. Shadows behave unpredictably in narrow architectural corridors. But to those already emotionally attentive to the moment, even small irregularities felt meaningful. And that is where the shift happens again. Because perception is not only about what is present, it is also about what the mind is prepared to notice. As these accounts spread, interpretations began dividing more clearly. One group continued emphasizing environmental and psychological explanations. They pointed out that post-storm conditions in dense historical architecture can easily produce overlapping sensory distortions, especially in places where sound, light, and movement constantly interact in narrow spaces. But another group began framing the same experiences differently. Not as isolated sensory effects, but as part of a broader feeling shift that seemed to align with earlier unusual reports across the city. And once multiple layers of interpretation start connecting unrelated impressions together, the narrative changes direction. Because now, people are no longer only reacting to individual experiences. They are trying to connect them, to organize them, to find meaning in their sequence. And in that process, even ordinary details begin to feel like they might belong to something larger. Whether they actually do or not becomes secondary, because the perception of pattern itself becomes the driving force. And now, the discussion around Jerusalem begins to move into its most sensitive phase yet, where environmental explanations, psychological interpretation, and symbolic meaning start overlapping in the same space. And from here, the story shifts again toward what people are beginning to describe as anomalies beyond perception rather than just atmospheric impressions. As daylight reports slowly settled into discussion, a new layer of accounts began emerging from the hours after sunset, and this time, the tone changed again. Because nighttime observations in Jerusalem carry a different psychological weight than daytime impressions. The city becomes quieter, shadows deepen between stone structures, and even normal sounds travel differently through narrow historic pathways. It is in this environment that the next wave of claims began to surface. Some individuals described brief, low-frequency sounds that seemed to come from beneath certain areas of the old city. Not loud enough to resemble construction or traffic, but noticeable enough to interrupt silence for a few seconds before fading again. Others mentioned faint vibration-like sensations while standing in specific elevated sections near ancient stone structures. Not strong tremors, not disruptive movement, just subtle internal pressure-like impressions that made people pause and look around, unsure whether they had actually felt something physical or simply imagined it. From a scientific standpoint, there are multiple possible explanations. Subsurface water movement after heavy rainfall, residual geological settling in an ancient layered city, or even normal urban resonance amplified by stone-heavy infrastructure. But what made these accounts gain attention was not their intensity, it was their timing. Because these night reports were not isolated. They appeared shortly after earlier daytime discussions about atmospheric shifts, visual impressions, and localized sensory changes in specific areas of Jerusalem. And that overlap began to influence how people interpreted them. At the same time, another category of reports began appearing online. Individuals claiming that certain areas of the old city felt unusually quiet, in a way that didn't match normal nighttime activity. Not absence of sound, but a noticeable reduction in environmental texture. The subtle background noise people usually stop noticing. This kind of description is difficult to verify objectively, but psychologically very powerful. Because when people expect silence in a meaningful place, silence itself becomes more noticeable. And once again, interpretation begins to shape experience. As these nighttime accounts spread, two narratives began developing in parallel. One continued to emphasize environmental factors, post-storm ground adjustment, humidity changes affecting acoustics, and natural shifts in urban sound behavior. The other began connecting these impressions back to earlier reports, suggesting that something consistent might be forming across different times of day and different parts of the city. Not a single event, but a sequence of subtle experiences that feel related when viewed together. And that is where the tension in the narrative increases again. Because once people start linking separate moments into a perceived pattern, the story no longer depends only on what happened. It begins to depend on what people believe is building up beneath the surface of everything they've observed so far. And now, attention begins shifting toward a more uncertain phase, where reports are no longer just about atmosphere or sound, but about moments that seem to briefly interrupt normal physical expectations in specific locations. As the discussion around nighttime reports continued to circulate, a new category of accounts began to appear, and this time, the descriptions became more specific in a way that made people pay closer attention. Not because they were fully confirmed, but because they described brief moments where normal physical expectations seemed to behave slightly out of rhythm. Some individuals claimed that in certain narrow sections of the old city, they experienced a sudden shift in environmental stability, like a very short-lived imbalance in spatial awareness. For a second or two, movement felt slightly disoriented, not vertigo in a medical sense, but a subtle sensation where walking, turning, or even standing still felt fractionally off before returning to normal almost immediately. Others described momentary visual disturbances during movement through stone corridors, where edges, shadows, or depth perception appeared briefly harder to judge under low-light conditions. These experiences were not consistent enough to be measured or recorded in any structured way, but they were consistent enough in pattern of description to begin drawing attention. And that is where interpretation once again becomes active. Because when multiple unrelated individuals describe similar types of short-lived perceptual disruption, especially in the same general zones of a historically dense city, people start asking whether there is a shared environmental cause. From a purely physical standpoint, there are still grounded explanations: uneven stone pathways, low nighttime lighting conditions, residual moisture affecting surface reflection, and the natural sensitivity of human perception in quiet, high-attention environments. All of these factors can combine to produce brief sensory inconsistencies without anything unusual occurring in reality. But what makes this stage of the narrative more intense is not the explanation. It is the accumulation, because these reports are not replacing earlier ones, they are stacking on top of them. Atmospheric shifts, visual impressions, sound irregularities, nighttime sensations, and now brief physical perception disruptions. Each layer alone can be explained, but together they begin to form a psychological impression of continuity, even if no actual continuous event exists. And this is where the human mind becomes the most important factor in the story. Because once a sequence of unrelated experiences is mentally connected, it begins to feel like a developing pattern rather than separate incidents. At the same time, public discussion around Jerusalem starts reflecting this shift. Some people continue to focus on environmental explanations and caution against overinterpretation. But others begin framing the situation differently, not as isolated anomalies, but as a gradual buildup of subtle, interconnected experiences across time and location. And neither interpretation fully overrides the other. Instead, they coexist, competing, overlapping, reinforcing attention in different ways. And as that tension builds, the narrative begins to move toward its most sensitive phase yet, where perception, interpretation, and expectation start blending so closely that separating them becomes increasingly difficult. Because now the question is no longer just what people are experiencing, it becomes whether these experiences are truly separate at all. And that question leads directly into what comes next. As the number of reports continued to grow, something important began happening beneath the surface of the discussion. The conversation was no longer focused only on individual experiences. It was beginning to shift toward connection. People started revisiting earlier accounts, not in isolation, but as part of a developing sequence. Atmospheric changes after the storm, brief visual inconsistencies in certain streets, localized sound irregularities, nighttime sensations of quiet pressure, and short-lived perception shifts in specific old city areas. Individually, each of these had already been discussed with possible natural explanations, but now they were being mentally placed side by side. And once that happens, the way people interpret information begins to change. Because the human mind naturally searches for structure, especially when multiple uncertain details exist within the same environment. So instead of asking what caused each of these separately, the focus slowly shifted toward a different question. Are these unrelated effects or variations of something happening across the same environment in different forms? And that question alone begins to reshape perception. At the same time, symbolic interpretation started quietly re-entering the discussion. Not as a dominant claim, but as a layer of meaning some people began attaching to the situation. Because Jerusalem is not only interpreted as a physical location in global awareness, it is also a historical and symbolic reference point in religious and cultural memory. So when uncertainty appears in such a place, interpretation often expands beyond physical explanation. Some people began referencing older historical and scriptural associations connected to the city, not to confirm anything happening in the present, but to frame how unusual events are often understood through meaning, not just mechanism. Others strongly pushed back against this direction, emphasizing that meaning is being added after the fact, not proven by the fact itself. And this is where the tension becomes more structured. Two interpretations developing side by side, one grounded in environmental and psychological explanation, the other leaning toward symbolic reading of patterns in a historically significant place. Neither fully cancels the other. Instead, they begin to overlap in the same conversation space. And once meaning is introduced into a discussion already built on uncertainty, the narrative starts to shift again. Because now, people are not only trying to understand what was experienced, they are trying to understand what it could represent. And that shift is subtle but powerful. It changes the direction of attention. It turns observation into interpretation. And it moves the entire discussion one step closer to its most emotionally charged stage. Because once people begin connecting separate impressions into a larger perceived structure, the question is no longer about individual reports. It becomes about whether all of this is pointing towards something beyond coincidence. And that is exactly where the narrative begins to tighten again. As discussion continued to spread beyond local conversations, the tone around these reports began to shift once again. Because now, the focus was no longer only inside Jerusalem, it was expanding outward. Online discussions, commentary threads, and interpretive breakdowns started grouping all earlier claims into a single broader narrative framework. Not as verified events, but as connected points in a growing pattern people were trying to make sense of. And once that framing appears, perception changes direction. Suddenly, earlier reports are no longer viewed as separate experiences tied to different times and locations. They begin to feel like parts of a continuous sequence. The atmosphere shifts after the storm, localized sensory irregularities in the old city, brief visual inconsistencies in stone-lined streets, sound and quietness fluctuations at night, and short, unexplained perception disruptions reported in concentrated areas. Individually, each category still has grounded explanations. But collectively, they begin to form what some people describe as a stacked impression, a layered sense that something has been unfolding in stages rather than appearing all at once. And this is where interpretation reaches its peak intensity. Because at this stage, the human mind is no longer only reacting to data points. It is reacting to structure, to pattern recognition, to the feeling that scattered details might be converging toward a single underlying cause even if that cause is not clearly visible. At the same time, global attention around Jerusalem as a symbolic and historical focal point amplifies this effect. Because the more a place is already embedded in cultural, religious, and historical awareness, the more likely it is for uncertain events to be interpreted as meaningful. And that does not require agreement, only attention. Some observers continue to emphasize natural explanations, post-storm environmental instability, urban acoustics in dense stone architecture, psychological sensitivity in high-attention environments, and the natural human tendency to connect unrelated events after exposure to repeated discussion. But others begin framing the situation differently, not isolated incidents, but as a convergence of multiple subtle signals that feel related when viewed through a broader lens. And neither side is able to fully dominate the interpretation. Instead, both continue to coexist in the same space, each reinforcing the existence of uncertainty in its own way. And that uncertainty becomes the central driver of engagement. Because now, the story is no longer anchored in what was individually seen or heard. It is anchored in what people believe is coming together beneath all of it. And once that perception takes hold, the narrative naturally moves toward its final phase, where reflection replaces reporting, and interpretation begins to outweigh observation entirely. As the discussion around Jerusalem gradually settles, something becomes clear. No single version of events fully dominates the conversation. Instead, what remains is a collection of interpretations, each shaped by what people noticed, what they felt, and what they believed those moments could mean. Some continue to view everything through a grounded lens. For them, the entire sequence of reports can still be understood through post-storm environmental behavior, urban acoustics in dense historical architecture, and the natural way human perception reacts when conditions suddenly change. From that perspective, nothing outside ordinary physical explanation is required, but others reflect on the same events differently. Not as isolated physical reactions, but as experiences that felt meaningful in a place already deeply tied to history, memory, and symbolic weight. And this is where the story ultimately settles, not into agreement but into perspective. Because Jerusalem is not just a location people observe, it is a location people interpret. And interpretation is never purely mechanical. It is shaped by emotion, expectation, and personal understanding. As time passes, the intensity of immediate reactions begins to fade. The urgency softens, the scattered reports stop feeling like separate signals, and what remains is something quieter. A reminder that human perception is not only about what happens in the world, but also about how the mind organizes uncertainty when certainty is not immediately available. Some people will leave this discussion convinced that everything can be explained naturally. Others will carry the feeling that the sequence of events felt too connected to ignore. And many will remain somewhere in between, acknowledging both explanation and uncertainty at the same time. But regardless of interpretation, one truth stays consistent. Moments like these reveal more about human attention than they do about the events themselves. Because people are not only reacting to changes in their environment, they are reacting to the meaning they attach to those changes. And that is why stories like this continue to circulate long after the moment has passed. Not because they provide final answers, but because they invite ongoing reflection. And in the end, perhaps that is the real outcome here. Not certainty, not fear, but awareness. Awareness of how easily perception, meaning, and interpretation can overlap when the world feels uncertain. And so the question is left open, not as a conclusion, but as a reflection. When we look at moments like these, are we witnessing something extraordinary happening in the world? Or something extraordinary happening in the way we understand it?